All eyes were directed at the black teenager who was standing in front of the bullying judge, known for his sharp tongue and condescending behavior. She was standing calmly, and he continued to rebuke her and mock her. But how did she shock everyone, and how was her intelligence that was completely unexpected to everyone? Is this the end of our story, or is it an unexpected beginning? Continue. With us, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive everything new. A sharp mind, a heart that couldn't ignore injustice, and a case that would change everything. 16-year-old Zariah Carter never thought helping her grandmother with groceries would lead her into a battle against forces far more powerful than a single greedy landlord. By the time Zariah Carter turned 7, she had already read more books than most adults would in a lifetime. Not just any books, legal textbooks, constitutional law, and court transcripts fascinated her in a way that fairy tales never could. Her grandmother, Hattie Carter, often found her curled up in the corner of their small but cozy home, nose buried in law books that were far too complex for a child. But Zariah was no ordinary child. At age 5, she stunned her kindergarten teacher by arguing why nap time should be optional based on individual rights and freedoms. By 6, she had memorized large portions of the U.S. Constitution and could recite amendments with an eloquence that left adults speechless. Ms. Hattie, a retired schoolteacher, recognized early on that Zariah had a mind built for something greater than the world was ready to acknowledge. "You're different, baby," Ms. Hattie often told her. "And different ain't bad. It just means you gotta work twice as hard to make folks see your worth." Zariah didn't just read. She analyzed, questioned, and debated every concept she encountered. Late at night, when other kids were dreaming of adventures, she was wide awake under a lamp, scribbling legal notes in the margins of thick books, deciphering arguments from Supreme Court cases, and crafting rebuttals in her head. Her hunger for knowledge was insatiable. By the time she was 12, Zariah was no longer just reading law books. She was challenging them. One day, Ms. Hattie took her to a legal studies lecture at a nearby university. It was a favor from an old friend who had noticed the girl's unusual intellect. The professor, an esteemed legal scholar, allowed Zariah to sit in on a debate about the legality of eminent domain. The room was filled with law students, some nearly a decade older than Zariah. When the professor opened the floor for discussion, a tall, confident sophomore stood up to defend the government's right to seize private land for public use. Zariah raised her hand. The professor, amused, nodded. "Young lady, you have something to say?" Zariah stood, her voice steady and sharp. "Yes, sir. You're citing Kelo versus City of New London to argue that eminent domain serves the public interest. But that case was flawed because it prioritized economic gain over constitutional rights. The Fifth Amendment states that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. But what's just is often subjective. What if we redefine public use to include corporate interests? Where does it stop?" A stunned silence filled the room. The sophomore who had spoken before her stammered, trying to counter her point, but Zariah had already outmaneuvered him. The professor leaned forward, intrigued. "Miss Carter," he said, "you have a mind that doesn't belong in a middle school classroom." Ms. Hattie smiled proudly. Zariah's presence at the university became a topic of discussion among the faculty. Some dismissed her as a novelty, but others saw something extraordinary in her. Whispers of her brilliance traveled beyond campus walls, and soon she was invited to attend law lectures unofficially. A child prodigy stepping into a world that had yet to acknowledge her full potential. At 16, Zariah had no formal law degree, but she understood the law better than most attorneys. She had no courtroom experience, but she had a relentless drive for justice. And on a rainy afternoon at Parker's Market, that drive was about to be tested. Zariah adjusted her glasses and gripped the handles of the grocery cart, maneuvering it around the aisles of Parker's Market. Her grandmother, Ms. Hattie, sorted through a display of tomatoes, mumbling about how food prices were rising. But Zariah's focus drifted to the front of the store, where a woman with 2 young children clinging to her stood by the register. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she pleaded with the store's accountant, Mr. Gleason. This wasn't just an eviction. It was fraud. The moment Zariah confronted the landlord, he laughed in her face. "A child lawyer? This is a joke," he scoffed. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood about the teenage prodigy taking on a legal case, and opinions were divided. Some were fascinated. Others mocked her, doubting she had the qualifications to do anything meaningful. Even Ms. Hattie, whose name was now making headlines, grew uneasy as the court date approached. On the day of the trial, Zariah's heart pounded in her chest. She had never been nervous about debating before, but this wasn't a classroom. This was a courtroom, and the judge presiding over the case was infamous for his harsh demeanor. Judge Alderman, a heavy-set man with a permanent scowl, narrowed his eyes as Zariah entered the courtroom. A slow smirk curled on his lips as he leaned forward. "What is this? Bring your child to court day?" he sneered, eliciting chuckles from the audience. Zariah clenched her fists. She had expected skepticism, but the sting of his condescension burned deeper than she anticipated. "I am here to represent Mariah Green in her wrongful eviction case, Your Honor," she said, keeping her voice even. Judge Alderman let out a booming laugh. "You? A little colored girl pretending to be an attorney? This ought to be good." A few gasps echoed in the courtroom. Ms. Hattie, seated in the back, tightened her grip on her purse. Zariah felt her stomach twist, but she refused to let her expression falter. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she said, lifting her chin, "the law doesn't discriminate based on age or race." The judge's smirk faded slightly. He waved a dismissive hand. "Let's get this circus act over with. Proceed." The audience whispered, some sneering, others watching with wary curiosity. The weight of their judgment settled on Zariah's shoulders. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just debating theories in a lecture hall. She was standing before a judge who wanted to see her fail. Taking a deep breath, Zariah shuffled her notes and began her argument, every word carrying the weight of generations before her. The trial had begun, and she would not back down. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge, the audience, and even the opposing counsel all seemed to be waiting for Zariah to crack under pressure. But she refused. She had come prepared, and today she was going to prove that intelligence and justice had no age limit. Zariah took a steadying breath and glanced toward Mariah Green, the woman she was representing. Mariah sat anxiously, hands clasped in her lap, her children fidgeting quietly beside her. This case wasn't just about proving a point. It was about keeping a family in their home. As the landlord's attorney presented his argument, Zariah listened intently, her mind racing ahead. They were relying on a so-called violation in Mariah's lease, a technicality that supposedly justified the eviction. But Zariah had spent countless nights combing through that lease, and she had found something they had overlooked. When it was her turn, she approached the judge's bench, holding up a copy of the lease agreement. "Your Honor, the defense claims my client violated the lease by making unauthorized modifications to the unit," she began, voice firm. "However, I direct your attention to Section 5, Clause C, which states that minor cosmetic changes do not constitute a breach unless they cause structural damage. The opposing attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair, scoffed. "She's grasping at straws, Your Honor." But Zariah wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, flipping the pages, in Section 9, it explicitly states that the landlord must provide written warnings and a 30-day period for tenants to rectify any alleged violations before initiating eviction proceedings. My client never received such notice. The judge furrowed his brows, scanning the document as the courtroom murmured. The landlord's attorney scrambled to counter, but Zariah was relentless. The eviction notice was served prematurely and in direct violation of the lease agreement, she added. Which means, Your Honor, this eviction is not only unjust, it is illegal. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The landlord's smug expression faltered. Zariah turned her gaze to the landlord himself. "Mr. Reese, I have a few questions for you." The judge raised an eyebrow, but nodded for her to proceed. The landlord shifted in his seat. "Go ahead, kid." Zariah's lips twitched at the dismissive tone, but she pressed on. "You stated earlier that my client painted the walls without permission, but isn't it true that you provided verbal consent when she asked?" Reese scoffed. "That's ridiculous. I never gave her permission." Zariah nodded. "Then can you explain why you sent a maintenance worker to deliver a color sample catalog to her apartment the day before she painted?" Reese's face paled. That never happened." Zariah pulled out her next piece of evidence, a written testimony from the maintenance worker. "According to Mr. Darren Cole, your employee, you not only allowed Ms. Green to paint, but provided her with options." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge held up a hand to silence them. "Is this true, Mr. Reese?" The landlord stammered, but before he could answer, Zariah delivered the final blow. "Your Honor, I would like to call a witness," Zariah announced. The doors to the courtroom opened and a man stepped in, a former tenant, Mark Ellis. "I lived in Mr. Reese's building for 3 years, Mark said as he took the stand. "He pulled the same stunt on me, claimed I violated my lease so he could jack up the rent and force me out." Reese's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the testimony. Mark detailed how Reese had used fabricated violations to evict tenants, making way for wealthier renters. Other former tenants stood in the audience, nodding in agreement. Judge Alderman's expression darkened. He turned to Reese. "I suggest you choose your next words carefully." The landlord opened his mouth but seemed to realize the futility of his situation. His attorney whispered frantically to him, but Reese's shoulders slumped. He had been caught. After a long pause, the judge sighed and looked at Zariah. "Miss Carter, against my better judgment, I have to admit, you presented a solid case." The courtroom held its breath. Judge Alderman turned to Reese's lawyer. "Based on the evidence provided, this eviction is unlawful. I'm ruling in favor of the tenant. Case dismissed." A stunned silence filled the room before Mariah burst into tears, hugging her children. The audience erupted, some in cheers, some in grumbling disbelief. Ms. Hattie, watching from the back, wiped away a tear. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. Zariah had just won her first case, but she knew this was only the beginning. Judge Alderman eyed her as she gathered her notes. "Miss Carter," he called out. She turned. The judge studied her for a moment before grunting, "Don't get cocky. One case doesn't make you a lawyer." Zariah smiled, unfazed. "No, Your Honor, but it's a start." The battle was over, but a war awaited, and Zariah Carter was just getting started. The atmosphere inside the courtroom thickened as Judge Alderman's irritation grew. Zariah's methodical dismantling of the landlord's defense had turned his amusement into frustration. His tone sharpened, and his taunts turned to outright interruptions. "You've made your point, Miss Carter," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "But let's not pretend you're a qualified attorney." Zariah, unfazed, straightened her back. "Your Honor, I may not be a lawyer, but the law doesn't change based on who presents it." Murmurs filled the room as the judge's expression darkened. He leaned forward. "You're treading dangerously close to contempt, young lady." Zariah remained calm, her voice steady. "Contempt of court is willfully disrupting proceedings, Your Honor. I am merely presenting facts." The landlord's attorney seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case. It is highly irregular to entertain arguments from a child." Judge Alderman hesitated, eyeing Zariah. Then he smirked. "Let's see where this goes. But be warned, Miss Carter, your entire argument hinges on perfection. One slip, and I'll have no choice but to rule against you." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some held signs of support, chanting Zariah's name. Others mocked her, calling her a child playing dress-up in a real-world battle. News outlets had caught wind of the trial, and cameras flashed as people debated whether this teenage girl had any business fighting a legal battle. Some scoffed, while others began to see her as a force to be reckoned with. Inside, Zariah pressed on, presenting a clause hidden deep in the lease. She waited for the perfect moment before revealing it, ensuring maximum impact. "This clause, Your Honor," she said, holding up the document, "clearly states that no tenant can be evicted on the basis of a violation unless formal notice is given, followed by a mandatory 30-day correction period." She turned to the landlord. "Mr. Reese, can you confirm whether my client received this required notice?" The landlord hesitated, glancing at his attorney, who was already flipping through papers in a panic. Zariah pressed harder. "Mr. Reese, did you or did you not provide written notice?" The silence stretched. Finally, the landlord muttered, "No, she didn't receive one." A ripple of shock coursed through the courtroom. Zariah continued, "Then, according to your own lease, this eviction is unlawful." The judge sighed heavily. His fingers drummed against the bench. "This is highly unusual." He looked at the landlord's lawyer. "Well?" The man fumbled for an answer but found none. "Your Honor, the lease may be outdated." Zariah cut in. "The lease is legally binding, no matter how inconvenient it is to your client." Judge Alderman frowned, clearly unhappy with how the case had turned. Just as it seemed Zariah had won, the judge suddenly leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "While your argument is compelling, Miss Carter, I cannot rule in your favor." The courtroom gasped. Zariah's breath hitched. "On what grounds, Your Honor?" The judge's expression hardened. "On a technical error in the paperwork. The appeal was filed under incorrect procedural protocol, rendering it invalid." Mariah Green's face fell, and her children clung to her. Zariah clenched her fists. "That can't be right. The evidence—" "The law is precise, and your argument, no matter how well formed, cannot overcome procedural errors." Tears welled in Mariah's eyes. The landlord smirked. The case was slipping away. But Zariah wasn't done. Straightening her shoulders, she took a breath. "Then I am formally filing an appeal." The judge scoffed. "On what basis?" Zariah's voice was unwavering. "A loophole. Per judicial process, any dismissed case on procedural grounds may be escalated to a higher court if contested within the same session. I contest your ruling, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge's scowl deepened, but he knew she was right. The battle had just begun, and Zariah Carter wasn't backing down.